The continent of Africa has had many kingdoms throughout its long history. Despite the prevalence of the Dark Continent myth, state formation in Africa was just as complex as anything else around the globe. And today, I wanted to talk a little about what we know about it. What up, African world? It's Home Team here, and welcome back to another video of African history, culture, and worldview. By supporting this channel on Patreon, you're helping in the creation of these videos and supporting this content. If you'd like access to full courses and sources, or you simply want to show your support, you may do so by clicking the Patreon link in the description box below. Most of the time when thinking about the formation of African kingdoms, we think of one ethnic group overpowering another through military conquest. Even though this can be seen throughout the continent, there are other ways in which African kingdoms expanded and even formed. I believe this topic is important because it sheds light on the complexities of African society, and it also helps us to understand the everyday needs and concerns of African people by revealing the diverse ways in which they formed kingdoms. To think of one ethnic group overpowering another to form a kingdom is an oversimplification, according to Professor Herbert Lewis. He makes a distinction between the formation of African kingdoms by separating them between the different phases of development, such as primary states and secondary states, all of which were formed in different ways. Primary states, according to his analysis, arose without the stimulus of other pre-existent states through the process of internal or regional development, and secondary states arose due to some sort of stimulus from another kingdom or established union between groups. Granted, all African kingdoms don't fit perfectly into these categories, as they can be blurred, but at the very least, we have a working model. Herbert theorizes that most of the historical kingdoms we acknowledge today in the history of the African continent are actually secondary states. For example, although we recognize the ancient Ghana or Wagadu Empire as the first vast empire in West Africa, some scholars suggest that it actually arose from an even older kingdom. This needs to be investigated more, but there does exist some evidence to suggest this. Now, some ways in which an African kingdom can develop without the sole use of conquest by force is when one African ethnic group expands agriculturally, and this expansion leads to the control over other agriculturalists in the area who are of similar ethnic origin. Professor Herbert Lewis uses the example of the Nupe, Maasai, Ashanti, Ganda, and Bemba people, who initially expanded their states to include their neighbors by these means. However, we should take more caution when including the Ashanti on that particular list. Another way in which Africans formed their kingdom without the use of military conquest was through the voluntary acceptance of lesser rulers or chiefs by non-monarchical people groups desiring the symbolic, spiritual, ritual, legal, and political gain from joining the kingdom. One very unique example of this would be one of the ways in which the Luba kingdom expanded its borders. Succession disputes were very detrimental to many African societies. Nearly every African state on the continent suffered greatly because of it. Families fighting each other over the throne totally left everyone at a loss. Because of that reality, some African kingdoms sought to remedy this, and the Luba people of Central Africa were one of them. But they did not only do this for themselves, they offered their services to neighboring kingdoms as well. Luba kings often extended their rule by intervening on behalf of one or another faction of the ruling lineage of a border kingdom. Helping to protect the royal succession of other states or vassal states is known by some scholars as lineage power broking. Luba kings also consolidated their power and expanded their borders by gaining access to the political and religious institutions of other kingdoms, as well as vassal kingdoms. The way in which they did this reveals the ingenious ways in which some African kingdoms expanded through religion and policy and not the sword. This was a very effective mechanism of expansion that did not put a strain on the use of human resources to accomplish a national objective. Another great example of this comes from another Central African kingdom known to us as the Congo Empire. Now, the complexity of Congo's socio-political structure runs very deep, and our modern Western perspective may have some trouble fully grasping it, because on paper, Congo is indeed an empire, but throughout the literature, the Mwene Congo, or kings of Congo, would frequently refer to themselves as a kingdom. There can be multiple reasons for why they did this. even knowing that they qualify as an empire. But by understanding the African concept of state formation, we might get why they did this. It's hard to classify Congo conclusively at times because it can be seen as a kingdom, an empire, and a federation all in one. It goes to show how little we've truly explored the complexities of African government or statehood. The reason why Congo can be considered all three is because initially, the Kingdom of Congo was a part of a loose federation, commonly referred to as the Seven Kingdoms of Congo Dia and Laza. Portuguese literature referred to the people in the area as the People of the Seven. In fact, one kingdom called Mbata was so closely aligned to Congo that the ruling elite from that kingdom could inherit the throne if Congo was in distress, and this could be done without any controversy. Another kingdom known as Loango was sometimes referred to as a good friend of Congo in Portuguese literature, even though they weren't traditionally considered a part of the federation. It was only 16th century Congo imperialism that drove the submission of the other kingdoms like the Kingdom of Matamba. However, the status of Matamba was quite different from the others, as they seemingly received the privileges of federation status. They occasionally paid tribute and were virtually independent. These blurred lines of Congo statehood speaks to the complexities of Central African politics. Before Congo's far-reaching imperialism, which manifested around the 16th century as mentioned before, Congo began to establish themselves and become more aggressive, seemingly above and outside the confines of their federation status when the Mwene Congo or King Lukeni Nimi began to flex his muscles over other kingdoms via conquest, intermarriage, and religious manipulation. Lukeni first established his capital at Mbanza Congo by expressing his military might, but also by intermarrying with the religious authority in that new region. This new family, if you will, were assigned some of their former lands after the conquest of Lukeni. However, what's difficult to understand is how the previous family who lived in the so-called conquered region would annually protest the rule of Lukeni in symbolic or ritual form. This symbolic protest was not vengeful but seemingly planned and institutionalized, suggesting that the region may have already been nominally or loosely a part of the original federation, and Lukeni may have simply enforced the integration through displays of power, intermarriage, and religious piety. As conjecture will hopefully allow, his attempt to control his neighbors and perhaps enforce the union may have produced a reaction which he did not intend, and this is why we see him intermarry with the family and even allow the annual symbolic protest of his rule, which had been commented on by a Portuguese visitor. Honestly, there are so many theories that we can come up with if we take just a brief look at how African kingdoms formed in the first place. It's really fascinating to learn just how intricate they can really be and how it involved or incorporated nearly every social, political, and religious system available. The way in which Congo's capital was formed and its power base can be called into question. However, it can't solely be simplified into the category of military conquest. As we can see, it was far more complex. I personally believe the complexity of state formation in Africa needs to be explored a lot more, as it sheds light on the political structure in Africa and shows just how advanced their system of governments were. It can also show how religion played crucial roles in statehood, just like it did in other parts of the world. Some secondary states in Africa were formed due to lesser rulers having ambition. These lesser rulers previously voluntarily joined or were forcefully integrated into a larger kingdom. In many cases, the king's representatives in newly won areas seek their own independent power. If a governor or vassal is able, he may defy the king, set himself up as ruler in his own area, and then try to defeat the army sent against him. If he wins, a new kingdom is created, and the new ruler, in his turn, will begin on a series of expeditions to collect tribute and bring new lands and people into his realm. This is an example of a derived or secondary state. The Kingdom of Soyo, which broke away from the Congo Empire, and also several multi-kingdoms were formed in this manner. The Ashanti became a vast kingdom because of this as well, as they were under the domination of another kingdom. An Ashanti Union arose as a confederation of largely independent communities joined together to fight Denkyera. According to former professor John Arundel Barnes at Cambridge, there was continual growth of new small kingdoms amongst the Nguni people as dependent or vassal rulers gathered their own followers, took over new lands, and became independent. Now, of course, the most familiar type of state formation in Africa is indeed conquest. In areas of dense population, closed resources, possibly a nearby strong kingdom where there is a rich reward for war in terms of land, cattle, or the control of trade routes, local groups may begin to wage serious wars among themselves under the direction of war leaders. Frequently, these groups are of the same linguistic and cultural background. In time, one may come to dominate its neighbors, and a small state will develop. But again, as discussed earlier, this was just one of the many ways in which Africans formed kingdoms and should not be viewed as the singular means by which Africans form states. Conquest through religion has been observed on the continent as well, especially amongst the Igbo people of Nigeria. The kingdom of Nri was not formed by the sword, but by the spirit, if you will. Loyalty to the religion became so vast that it formed a sort of federation. Essentially, the Igbo priesthood were spiritual warriors who converted the people of southern Nigeria into the belief system, gaining the loyalty and support of various towns and villages. The Kushite Empire, seen from a more liberal point of view, can also be viewed as an African state that was derived in a religious manner. King Paenki saw what he believed to be religious corruption in Egypt, and he was invited by the priesthood to liberate the Nile Valley from ambitious Egyptian princes and Libyan lords. The Kushite Empire was formed through a process of military fighting, but also through significant displays of political and religious power. For example, before King Paenki joined his troops further north, he was essentially coronated as ruler at the Opet festival in Thebes, thus giving him the spiritual go-ahead from the people to rule the entire Nile Valley. After just a few victories, the Delta rulers of the north submitted to him without a fight and acknowledged him as ruler. He stayed true to his holy war and did not execute his enemies, but allowed them to rule in the region under his authority. We have a tendency to view King Paenki as an all-powerful conqueror, but some of the work was also done through religious networking and political positioning. Herbert Lewis persists that the idea of conquest taking precedence over the other dynamics of monarchical organization in Africa is misleading when it comes to African history. The origin and formation of African kingdoms should be viewed from a much broader scope, especially in light of our exposure to ancient and medieval African politics. Well, I'm all out, guys. If you like these videos and want to help in its continued production, consider supporting the home team on patreon.com. The link is in the description box below. Know thyself. Remember your ancestors. Peace.